Welcome back to Office Hours. We are talking about lenses today. And if you make content, lenses are a critical part of everything you do. I started in video, actually. I wasn't a still photographer then, but I had clients who asked me for those. And when I got into the world of still photography and started learning about it, I realized how much I didn't know from my early days when lenses were something on a video camera. They all worked kind of the same way, particularly the big cameras that I worked with back then. Most of those lenses were what are called parfocal lenses, which means that once you set the back focus, the lens stays sharp through an entire zoom range. And it was only when I got into the world of still cameras that I realized that most of what happens out there doesn't work that way in the still ways. They are varifocal lenses, which means that as you zoom in, you will go out of focus and have to change the focal acuity of the lens kind of as you go. It's a whole different way of thinking about things. It's very much a different mindset. But the more I got into lenses, the more I understood how much technology goes into making a high-quality lens. It is an amazing process of coatings and multiple elements. And you get into these problems, things like chromatic aberration, that is hard to first see. But as you get into using things that come through a still camera lens particularly, when you zoom in or you want to capture a frame off of that and go close, you see all these little anomalies that lens manufacturers understand, and they have to use technology to try to work around. So I'm going to see if we're really lucky and this comes up when I hit. Nope, it didn't. I had some great images, and it looks like until we can get a break and I can try to do this, I wanted to show you some things. If I can get this up in the next thing, and I may just do it as a screen share here on my we'll look at things like field of view. I want to show you how different lenses change the way people look in portraiture. That's a very important thing. And when I was starting to do still photography, I was confused by the fact that my still friends would use a lens that I didn't think was the right lens for doing something like a close-up shot of a person. And as they helped me understand how it worked, I realized that the difference between getting, say, a 24 millimeter or even a 35 millimeter lens and standing 6 foot for somebody and standing back 30 feet or 20 feet using a 70 to 200 out at maybe 150 millimeters and pushing in on them to get the same framing was giving me the same field of view of their face, but was changing their face. And that's kind of what I want to show you as we go through
and
this.
Bill, if you want to take a minute, I can go off. I can talk for a little bit.
Yeah, why don't you do that? Let me see if I can get this out, because I think you'll really enjoy some of the graphic images that I've got, and I'll do it as a screen share maybe.
Yeah, so beyond the framing and those types of things, there's a couple things that you have to think about. Is number one is, are you shooting video or still? As Bill talked about, parafocal is going to allow you to it's going to allow you to do a back focus. So if you're zooming, if you want to zoom, if you have a zoom lens and you want to zoom in and out, your issue is that things will drop out of focus with a still lens, and they will stay in focus for a video lens. And so that's one thing to think about as you start to design those. Other things couple things that I think about. Number one is how fast is the lens? And when we say how fast is the lens, typically what we mean is what is the widest aperture that you can open. And Bill's going to have some pictures here, but I'm just going to go through a couple of things.
Yeah, actually, I think I'm ready. So just finish up your thought.
I'll just go through this list real quick because I'm not sure how long I can stay today. So the
perfect.
So the f-stop, the speed, I tend to get very fast lenses. So I tend to want to have. I tend to want to have things that 2.8 is kind of where most of the lenses that I buy, not all of them, but most of the lenses I buy live on. 4.0 is probably the slowest lens that I buy. And sometimes you may be looking for a 1.2 or 1.8. These are going to give you the ability to shorten that depth of field and get more light, especially if you're not using a lot of light for what you're doing. Glass quality is important. So when you think, why is a 50 millimeter lens that is a super speed, 10 times more expensive than the Canon lens that's really, really nice? It's because of the glass quality. It's oftentimes there's a lot more. Oftentimes there's a lot more glass. It's a lot heavier, and it's going to be and it's going to go through a lot more of it and it's going to give you more precise control over that. Of course, zoom versus primes. A lot of people in film will tell you that they don't use a lot of zooms. They use prime lenses. The prime lenses are almost always going to be sharper than the zoom lenses are. And a lot of times they're moving with their feet or a jib people move the camera rather than zoom in. It's kind of the way it looks there. Now, also, some lenses will color the image. So some lenses are cooler or warmer or other things. We use, on some of the events that we've used, we use K35s. These are old Canon lenses that you can't buy anymore, but you can rent them, and you get these big blooms off of that are beautiful. But each lens has its own thing that you're actually using to do that. Of course, as I said before, sharpness. How sharp is that lens? And there's a lot of resolution charts that we might put those against. And that's where you start to see when you put a real lens on there, an Angenieux or a Super Speed or Cooke lenses, you're going to see a level of sharpness that you're not used to with your still camera. So, with your still, camera lenses or lenses under $5,000. Do you need to attach it to external motors? So if we have someone doing follow focus, we need gears on the outside of the lens, or we're going to have to add them. Bill, you got an open mic. So we've got gears that we have to attach the motors to, and for zoom, focus, aperture. And so do we have those? A big film lens will typically have those gears on the outside. You're going to put it on rails, and you're going to tighten it there. How far are you shooting? So do you need a zoom lens to get in there? Does it need to be powered? So a lot of the ENG lenses will have their own motors that are kind of built into the whole system. So those are some of the more, beyond the art, those are some of the practical things that a lot of us think about as we start to, think about the lenses that we want to use. I will say that as the last thing I'll say about the art is really the distortion. And so the wide lenses will tend to stretch things out or push things out, whereas the long lenses tend to flatten them. And a lot of times, folks like me, if I'm shooting something that's going to be portrait style, I'm going to be looking on a full frame sensor, 50 to 85 is what a lot of us end up using for that type of thing. It's a very natural view. So those are the things that I look at when I'm thinking about lenses. Now I'm going to hand it back to Bill, who's got pictures.
I do have some pictures, and let's dive right into them because you want to be able to see some of these things. So hopefully you'll be able to see. The first one is about field of view. And this is starting on the left side at small wide lenses. This is a 15 millimeter field of view, and you can see the triangle here showing that. And as you go up to longer and longer throw lenses, you see how the field of view is narrowing substantially as you go through this. That means that the amount of coverage you get of the whole thing, of your whole frame written to the sensor, is going to change radically depending on what lens. Now, if you have a fixed lens, let's say you have a 35 millimeter lens right here, that is going to end up being fixed, and that's your field of view. And what Alex was talking about, the only way you can change the size of your subject relative to the picture that you're taking of them is to move in or move out. And people who use fixed focus lenses are used to doing that. And he made a really good point about putting it on a jib so you can easily change not just the angle of your shot, but how much of the subject gets into your frame. As you get out here into the tall ends of these, you get a very, very narrow field of view, but some other things happen too, and that's really what I wanted to talk to you about here in terms of the next picture. This is portraiture in different lenses. And I've got a little example here. I mean, we're starting with a 24 millimeter shot up in the upper left-hand corner, and we're extending. They look a little similar right now, all the way up to this 135. But I've got this little demo here, and I wanted to go and take just two of these shots. Here's the shot at 24, and here's the shot at 135. And you'd say to yourself, well, there's some different things, but I'm not sure what they are. And I want you to very specifically look at the nose of this model and watch what happens as you move between that wide angle lens at 24 millimeter and the 135 millimeter lens. If you go back and forth pretty quickly between these two shots, you'll see that the facial exaggeration of features changes rather dramatically. In the long shot, her nose doesn't appear to be as prominent and as coming out of the picture towards you as it is in this other one. And there are other things like her chin shape. the way her hair is picked up against it. And I understand these backgrounds are a little bit different. But to me, this is the fascinating part of this. You actually change the geometry of how someone looks by picking these different lenses. This is why when I was doing a lot of portrait photography for one of my corporate clients, I decided to go with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, get back from the people, and then zoom in to maybe 120 millimeters or something like that. The reason I was doing that is that I wanted everybody's picture to look as close to the same as I can. This was going to go often in corporate gallery shots or a page of these are our executives. And so you don't want there to be a lot of aesthetic difference between the photographs. And by doing this with the lenses, by choosing a longer lens and moving back from them, I could diminish the differences in their faces through the portraits and give everybody kind of an even weight through that process. Here's the next slide I wanted to show you, and we're talking about a couple of things. Aperture. In this particular case, the aperture is how big the opening is, and it has a couple of effects on your portraiture. First, obviously at f32 down here at the far end, that's a very small aperture. It's letting very much little light, but it's going to have the effect down here below it of keeping a lot of depth of field in your shots, right? As you go up this history all the way up to a wide open f1.4 lens, you're down here where your subject is going to be very sharp and your background is going to be very much out of focus. So this is why we talk about being wide open and doing sometimes, I want that shallow depth of field cinematic look. The way you achieve that is keeping your aperture as far open as you can, given the amount of light coming in. It's also important to understand that this is always a balance between how much the opening is letting the light in and how much light you have, which is why we talk a lot about the fact that when we're using smaller apertures and getting more depth of field, you need more light coming in. You can shoot daylight like this, but if you're shooting in a dark nightclub and you're stuck down here at f22 on your camcorder or something, you're going to need a lot of light to bring that exposure up to the point where it's comfortable for everyone. It's just a whole different thing. One other thing, the other piece of this puzzle is this ISO idea. And ISO is digital gain or amplification done to the signal coming off the sensor. And this is a good example about how the fact that on the left, it's a clean image because it is a very low ISO 100. But if you crank the ISO up a lot, and if your camera isn't built for dual ISO shooting, you can get a lot of image grain, which is all sorts of problematic, particularly in our modern era, where we don't want to have to spend a lot of time doing noise reduction of our content after the fact. In fact, quite the opposite here. The other piece of this puzzle is, of course, shutter speed. And shutter speed is also going to determine how much light you're allowing through the lens and to hit the sensor of your camera. On the low end, a 1,000th of a second shutter speed on a still camera is going to let very little light in, but you're going to get that tremendous depth of field. So sports photographers and people like that want to keep down at really high speeds to freeze action. And as you go up here toward the top end, that's a 1/4 of a second exposure on a still camera. And it makes a huge difference in what people see. Here's the next one. This is a practical example. If you're shooting something like a pinwheel spinning, which effect do you want? You want a blurred color piece, or do you want that pinwheel to be sharp because you've frozen it in time, and that is all about shutter speed. I'm just going to do a couple of really quick marks. Here's some things to maybe think about as you go through. I'm not going to talk about each one of these. I'm just going to say, look through this list, and if there's anything in particular that you want to focus on, ask questions about it. There's already a good group of questions coming up. The final point I wanted to make, I took a couple of pictures of some lenses that I have. You can see that these two lenses look almost identical. This is Canon L glass, but these lenses are very different. So by looking at a lens, you really can't tell what the designer of the lens has put into this. On the left here, we are seeing a 16-35. On the right, a 24-105. They are also different in terms of their speed. This is an f2.8 lens. This is an f4 lens. So the amount of design for passing light through the lenses in these two very similar looking lenses are different. So you have to be careful when you're selecting lenses and buying lenses and looking to increase your lens kit, that you pay attention to all these aspects. And this is across the board, whether you're shooting video on your still camera, whether you're using a production cinema camera, understanding these relationships, f-stop, how fast the lens is, what kind of sensor you're using, the size of the sensor. I mean, that's one of the things we've struggled with for a long time, is that there's more than one sensor thing. We talk about full frame cameras being very close to what a frame of 35 millimeter film was designed to be. And all those full frame sensors project their image on the full width of that sensor. When you get into crop sensors or things that are different, you have to do some changing in understanding how that affects your focal length or your zoom or anything else. So there's just a lot to learn in here. That's all I really wanted to say off the top of that. So I'm going to open it up to the panel. Alex has chatted for a moment. Anything else you want to touch base on before we go?
No. To the questions.
All right, we're gonna dive into questions now. So Alexander, take us into the first one.
All right, Paul Walhus in Austin, Texas asks, what zoom lens would work best for Zoom meetings using a Panasonic GH5 with a 98-inch TV as an LED wall? With the Olympus M.Zuiko Digital ED 12 to 45 millimeters f4 Pro lens, cut it.
Alexander, dive into it.
Well, I think I would need to know a little bit more about how things are situated. So you've got a large LED TV behind you. My question would be, how far away is the TV in the background from where you are, and are you just going to be standing and not moving around at all? I would tend to use a prime lens, and actually Sigma has a really nice micro four thirds lens for that is a 30 millimeter. So I would say if you're within 3 feet, or is it not 3 feet, but if you're within 4 or 5 feet of the camera and then that TV's behind you, you really want that shallow depth of field there. You may not want that TV behind you fully in focus. So something like that would work well. And this is the 30 millimeter f1.4. Does support autofocus as well, which is really nice. And that should work decently well on the GH5. They also make a 56 millimeter. So if you need to have that camera much farther away from you, that is also another option if you need another focal length. But 30 millimeter I find works pretty well if you're relatively close within that camera and you can't get it farther away from you. That would work really well. Again, I don't know with the quality of that TV. I've actually never shot in front of a TV or LED walls before, and other people in the panel have a lot more experience with that, so I'll let them chime in there.
All right, we're going to move on to Courtney for a second. Courtney.
Yeah, it kind of depends on. I would go with a short zoom, like you're talking about, at 12 to 45. That gives you a lot more flexibility in finding the exact size that will keep the bezel of that background TV out of the frame, because you want to probably include as much of it as you can without getting it in. And so that that's determined, of course, by the zoom of the lens and the distance of the camera from the background TV. And then you can, once you get that set, then you can position yourself a few feet in front of it and see how it looks and see how you look in that particular lens. Whether or not to use autofocus, that is the question. If you're going to use a background image on that screen, you may want to keep it a little bit out of focus. So if you have autofocus, you might want to turn it to manual focus and just make sure your talent stays in the focus zone. And you might want to shoot at a little higher f-stop so that you have a little more depth of field and pull the person a little further away from that background screen so that you can keep it slightly soft so you won't get moire and yet give you enough depth of field to keep the person's face in focus without having to turn on any kind of autofocus. And I'm not sure if that Olympus M.Zuiko 12 to 45, when you put it on a Panasonic camera, if it supports autofocus or not. So check that out if you are going to use autofocus. The danger of using autofocus is it might find something. It depends on the methodology that they use for doing autofocus, whether it's just contrast or whether it's a smart autofocus in the GH5, whether it does face detection. If it does face detection, it may work okay. If it does contrast, if you've got a contrasty image behind you, it may throw the focus to the background. So watch out for that.
Alex.
Yeah, the GH5 autofocus will be a little slow. It's why we don't use it anymore. so the if you stay still, it'll be fine. I think that so it's not a super responsive, and I have to admit that again, if I'm only doing it by myself, the reason I moved to Sony's was because of the autofocus. And I think that if you have somebody else managing it, they can be changing focus with you. You won't. The thing is I don't know if I would go with an f4. I'd probably agree with others to go to an f2.8, not because you'll be at 2.8, but because the camera tends to be sharper in the center of where it's at rather than right at the very end. So if you get an f4, it's going to be a little softer at f4 than a 2.8 will be at f4. So you have to kind of know that you're going to have a little bit of better sharpness there. You also may want to open up a little bit. You can force the depth of field by softening the background in a monitor, but the thing you do have to be very, very careful of, as Alex outlined, is the moire, as well as seeing any of the pixelation or anything there is something that does become a little bit of a problem. So the first thing you'll do is want to separate yourself from that monitor, and the second thing you'll want to do is be in a shorter depth of field. The other issue is pulling that camera further back. So what you want to do is get that camera further away, because that's going to require your TV to be not as big. The wider your angle and the closer you are, the bigger that TV is going to have to be. Now you've got a 98 inch, and so you've got some room to work. But as far as you pull that, most of the time I've done it with an 85 or even a 75. But what we do is we pull the camera further back and zoom in. When I try to figure this stuff out, a lot of times what I do is I rent them, borrow lenses or something like that. I rent 2 or 3 lenses to figure out what I actually want to use for this. We could probably guess in some of these areas if you show us the actual geometry, because the geometry of what lens you use is how big is your space, where is your camera, where is the TV, how far away are you from the TV, where are you sitting there? And those are a whole bunch of things that we have to figure out before we can tell you exactly what lens. But I would really recommend a 2.8 lens for what you're doing. I've built a lot of these, and I wouldn't build it with a 4.
Yeah, it's funny how much difference there are when you get down to the subtleties. Alexander, you want to get back in on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment because Paul actually is in the chat, and he's saying he wants everything to be fully in focus. So that would concern me with the LED. I mean, how does that change?
I think he wants to be fully in focus. I don't think you want. You definitely don't want the TV in focus. Like that's like you don't like that's going to be problematic for you. Like and you can try it, but moire and seeing if the TV is truly in crisp focus behind you. Number one is it's almost never a pleasurable picture. Like to have a sharp image. If you watch Sunday Morning, when you can always tell when they do green screen instead of the TV, and I can tell you, there's the little red pill conversation about the green screen. The person in the foreground looks softer than the background, and that's because that background was not blurred, and there's a softness because they had to turn some of the detail down to get a green screen without an edge. And so what they ended up with is this soft person sitting in front of it. There's 1 or 2 people every Sunday morning when I watch these Sunday morning politics shows that has I'm like, oh, they totally host you. Like they like wherever they sent you to jump in, you would have been better off at home with a good camera. So
when I used to shoot corporate portraiture, I'd have 30 people go through over the course of each day for 3 days. They used to try to say, well, we can use the conference room for the portraits. And the first thing I said was, no, let's look around the building. Or do you know anybody, can we get people to come to an actual studio? And what I was looking for was that depth of space, because I knew I was going to have to set up probably a white screen if you're doing those knockout corporate portraits. And I needed some space behind that so that I could rig it and go in and change it if I needed to extend it or something like that. I wanted working space behind my white screen. I wanted maybe 6 minimum, 7 or 8 if I could, between the white screen and my subject who was going to stand on the dot that we had put on the floor. And then I wanted another 15 feet or so back to the camera position. That's a large distance. Most office spaces don't give you that luxury to be able to set up exactly each of your elements at the geometry that you want in order to push in with the camera and get the portraits that look similar for everybody quickly and easily. And when you're doing portraiture like that, when you're doing those kind of corporate gigs, time is definitely money. All these things balance together. It's not one thing. It's not, I could have shot those portraits. I could have moved the camera forward and used a 50 millimeter fix and it would have been fine. It just would, that compression example of the faces, I was just looking for as much consistency in the portraits of the different people as possible. So that was my strategy. And without understanding how these lenses work in terms of focal length and zoom or how big the aperture, without knowing all of this, it's really hard to make good decisions to get what you want out of a thing like that. I didn't want a whole lot of variable portraits coming out of that. They were supposed to all look quite the same, just different people. Let's go to the next question.
Talalik Lopez Waterman in Wilmington, Delaware asks, is still photography the number of iris flags are a factor? Is this the case in video as well?
Can be. Alex?
Courtney may correct me. I've never had a conversation on a film set about how many flags are in the iris. If we're talking about the number of the number of elements there, I don't think we've ever had that conversation. It may matter to some people, but I've never had the conversation on a film set.
Courtney?
Yeah, you're talking about leaves in the shutter, and a shutter is made up of leaves that move in and occlude the air where the light is passing through, and it affects your bokeh. So there's a lot of artsy photographers that want this a certain shape bokeh, to be nice and round, and it depends on whether you're working anamorphic or not. The lens flares can be different, and the bokeh you can actually see the shape of the shutter of the iris. In the bokeh. So if you have the fewer number of leaves you have in the iris, the more strange the bokeh is going to look, because it could be, you see a pentagram, for example, a 5-sided shutter. You'll see that in the bokeh sometimes. So the more number of leaves, the rounder the bokeh will be.
Yeah, and we're moving more toward electronic shutters and not the manual shutters from these DSLRs and things like that in the past, where exactly what Courtney was saying, if you want your highlight lights that are out of focus and back to have a particular shape, you're very concerned with this. Most of the time in video, I've never heard anybody ask. I have not, just as Alex experienced, had anybody want to change lensing on a video camera so that you could get that kind of specific directed bokeh. Let's go to the next question.
Tommy Johnson, St. Paul, Minnesota asks, is there anything that is optically special in the glass for the different size sensors or image formats?
Alex?
The big thing is can the glass resolve to the resolution that is being provided by the chip? So what you get into is that you that you have to kind of think about that process if you have a really large chip or you have a very high resolution, can the glass actually give you that resolution? And so that's where you see oftentimes chips outrunning the glass. And so you have to be very careful. And that's why a lot of times when you really have to oversample that. You're not really sampling, but you have to have a glass that's able to be much sharper than the chip can handle so that it's really getting all that information. And so that's the real thing that you worry about especially with smaller glass. When it matters, I shoot a lot of stuff with smaller lenses and it looks fine, but when I'm getting paid to do it, oftentimes the cost of the lenses changes pretty dramatically.
Also, I will say that as you move up in lens classes and costs, some of these things fall away, because if you're paying $200 for a lens, these are issues. If you're paying $2,000 for a lens, at that level, the optical science, the coatings to avoid chromatic aberration, the people selling lenses at the top end of the lens scale have put a lot of science and a lot of time, and they're competing against their competitors in terms of these minute differences. And so after a while, if you're all shooting with Canon L glass or Zeiss lenses or something like that, your expectation at paying that much for a lens is that most of these little details are going to fall away, and they will have worked at the top end of optical science to make this the best lens they can at that price point. So if you can't afford to work with higher end lenses, some of these considerations just fall away. They're working at the edge of the science that they can provide for you. Next question.
Next question is from Josh Kaufman in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Every lens is a compromise, be it price, weight, complexity, or favoring one virtue over another. What might the compromise of using one of the wide-angle distortion correction lenses, such as Laowa Zero-D line for video?
Alex?
I'm not familiar with the Laowa. I mean, generally distortion, wide-angle, distortion correction, I usually worry about a little bit because what you tend to see sometimes, if and again, I'm not familiar with this one. I'm just trying to pop it up here. Well, that didn't come up. If it's changing it optically, there are some that'll basically allow you to do a tilt shift. And that's going to straighten out things that are there. If it's doing it in the glass itself, or it's doing some kind of distortion, a lot of times it tends to go towards you tend to add chromatic aberration. So you have to be kind of careful of how it's doing distortion correction.
And whether or not that chromatic aberration shows up on the thing you're doing, if it's a wide-angle scene and it's kind of a soft outdoor kind of a thing without a lot of detail, you may not notice the fact that chromatic aberration is present. You take that same thing, you capture a still off of your video, and you decide you want to blow it up large, and all of a sudden that fringing around hard edges and things like that you didn't notice in the original use case becomes that doesn't look like I want it to look. I wish my edges were really clean. And so sometimes these things are real, but they're not evident the way you're looking at it until you learn to look for it. And then okay, I don't use that lens if I'm going to blow up to a wall-size portrait of somebody. Courtney?
Yeah, I'm not sure how these Zero-D lenses necessarily work. If they just change the sphericality of the grind of the lens so that it's not perfectly hemispherical anymore and it's slightly anamorphic, to correct for the barrel distortion. And if it's doing that, one thing you might run into is lens flares may look funny. It may look more vertical. It may change the shape of lens flares. So that would be a telltale that the lens is not a spherical lens. It has some distortion of the lens to correct for the barrel distortion of the wideness of that.
Yeah, we should talk for a little just moment about anamorphic lenses. These are lenses that are designed to shoot usually wider than the frame. If you're putting an anamorphic on a 35 millimeter movie camera, you want to capture a lot of detail in that width, but you actually the lens stretches the image out. What Alex was talking about kind of in that pre-show first hour discussion, it'll actually be distorted. Everybody on the production pipeline understands that they're going to squeeze that back to get more pixel detail in a less wide format, and that is commonly done on movie sets and things like that, shooting anamorphic lenses as opposed to lenses that look correct. Even in the field, they're going to have an anamorphic squeeze put on the monitors so that it looks right for the director and everybody else. But if you pull that into the edit bay and you actually throw it up on your monitor, it's like, whoa, everybody's stretched out a little bit horizontally. They're doing this for the reasons of maintaining resolution from the camera lens through post-production, and they know they're going to process it on the back end. Let's go to the next question.
Next question is from Robert Shoji in Los Angeles. What focal length provides the most natural image?
Alex?
It's usually 50 to 85. So if you're taking pictures of someone and you're trying to have it look the most like what our eye is looking at a full frame sensor, 50 to 85 is usually considered the most natural looking of, it's minor, but past 85 starts to have a more flat view, and under 50 tends to start to look more distorted.
Yeah, I would say I love the pictures on the internet where they go back to a historic place and they hold up a photo next to them of what the place used to look like in the old days. So, they tore down the windmill. They're holding up a black and white old photo of the windmill that was there in 1890 or something like that against the regular photo. That kind of reality versus photographic capture, I mostly hear exactly the same range that I was talking about, 50, 85 millimeter fixed focal length lens, some prime that is really clear and good. Let's go to the next question.
Dalalik Lopez Waterman in Wilmington, Delaware asks, is it possible to have a very fast zoom lens, or does the extra glass necessarily slow them down?
Alex?
It is much harder to build those elements. So it's all the elements that are there to get them to be able to transmit that light gets harder and harder. So zoom lenses tend to be a little bit slower than some of the options that you would have in a prime. But it just gets a lot more expensive really fast. So there are, especially when it's a fixed aperture. So you'll see some that are like, oh, I'm 2.8 when I'm zoomed out, but as I go longer, it goes down to 4.5. So to get a fixed fast lens, and usually, I mean, you can get stuff that is actually faster than 2.8. That's a zoom. But man, you're spending real money now. So that's the, like it's a lot of glass, it's a lot of precision to get that to actually work. But you can do it, but it jumps in price pretty dramatically.
Yeah, go do some searching on something like Zeiss primes, a set of them. You'll get 5 lenses.
Well, that's the primes, but when you go into the main thing here is when you're talking about zoom lenses to get to that same speed tend to be pretty expensive.
No, I'm just saying even in the fixed, you can get into $20,000-$30,000 for a set of prime lenses. That's how much science they put into making those lenses perfect.
I had two Fujinon lenses that were I think 85 to 300. These are the and I think they were $30,000 each. And they were
highly precision instruments.
And they weren't considered a particularly nice lens. They were a solid lens for production, not that we're not talking about ingenue lenses or other lenses that are start to step up a lot further than that.
Courtney?
Yeah, when you get into the zooms, you'll usually go up to, you won't see the 0.9s that you'll see in the primes. The Cook makes some super speed zooms that start at about T3. That aren't even that long. They're like 20 to 60 millimeter, that range. But it's really hard, as Alex said, to get the number of elements down and have an aperture still large enough. Though the lenses get huge and heavy too.
I think it was a real story in Hollywood that Kubrick, when he was doing, was it Barry Lyndon, got a set of primes that were like 0.8. And they were able to shoot in candlelight as a practical light for many of those scenes. But those are very specialist. I mean, he had to search out and find the one set of lenses that would do what he wanted, and they'd been made way back in the past. It's really hard to get super fast, super correct, beautiful lenses. It takes a lot of skill to build those. Let's get to the next question.
Speaking of fast, the next question's for me. When referring to aperture lenses that are f2.8 and lower, what makes them fast? Are lens elements internally moving faster than an f4.0?
No, it's qualitative measurement. Alex, go ahead and dive into it.
It's just the way we term it. That it's fast, that it can go wide open, and it's going to give you a lot more light. But it's not. There's nothing about the mechanics of the lens that make it fast. It's just that we refer to them as fast lenses when they're able to when they can open up and let a lot of light in.
And I think part of the colloquialism comes to the fact that you can have a faster shutter speed and still get enough light through them because the lens itself is passing the maximum amount of light that can be passed. And there's nothing in there that makes it any less transmissive than another lens. So that lens becomes thought of as fast. Let's move to the next question.
Josh Kaufman from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania asks, what visualization tools can be used to determine lens choice from the planning stages based on a blueprint or layout drawing of a venue?
Interesting question. Alexander, start us off.
Well, I found I don't do really high-end productions, but I found this tool very useful there's an iOS app, and it's called Magic Cinema Viewfinder. And what that allows you to do is uses the camera on your phone. You just point it at wherever your subject's going to be sitting, for example, and you select the type of sensor size that you have. And you can select the focal length, and it will show you in real time how that's going to look. So that's actually how I picked a lot of the lenses for my studio space, is that app, because it showed me, well, okay, if someone's only 6 feet away, if I put an 85 mil on there, it's going to be, their head is going to be massive and fill the entire frame, and I don't want that, right? So that app has been very useful to me, and I'm sure other people have other suggestions.
Alex?
Yeah, SketchUp has an entire plugin that basically works inside of it that reproduces all these lenses along with depth of field. So between SketchUp and Unreal Engine, those are two great visualization tools.
Yeah, there are quite a few apps, though. You go in the App Store and you look for Lens Chooser or something along those lines, you'll find a lot of little iOS apps that use the camera lens and then maybe matte in on this sensor for this.
CAD-RAGE is a really popular one. Artemis is the other one. I use Artemis. For my stuff. It's a little more expensive, so people get tweaky about it, but CAD-RAGE is the other one.
Yeah, so you can find tools and do explore. Learning about lenses is, I think, a great joy. Alexander, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, just one quick thing. I just forgot to mention that the Magic Viewfinder camera, it does actually have a depth of field calculator here as well, so that is also very useful.
Yeah. Courtney?
Yeah, there's also online, you can find these field of view calculators that just have their web pages. You just plug in the millimeter of lens, the field distance, and so on, and it will calculate and give you the width and height of the field of view of that particular lens at that distance. So it does all the math for you. The other ones that you were talking about, the apps, can maybe give you a visualization of that rather than just numbers.
Yeah, they also, if you are thinking about renting a lens, I've used these tools occasionally that the rental house has this lens and I want to see, well, what is that going to look like in the field for my shoot? So you can load into your iPhone something that will allow you to kind of set the parameters of a particular lens and get a view of what that might look like. They're all kind of, they're calculating what it'll look like rather than showing you the actual, but still it's a useful tool. All the tools are useful. Let's go to the next question.
Robert Green in Los Angeles asks, does having great tools like Topaz AI affect your choice of lens and or ISO setting?
Alex?
Definitely not. Topaz is a great tool, and I use it for a variety of different things, both for the photo and for the video tools. But I will not shoot something going, I'm going to be able to. I don't want to fix anything in post. I want to have the best image I can possibly get on site with the best lenses and the best cameras that I can afford for that show. But I definitely don't want to skimp a little bit because I think I can fix it later. Topaz is right, we need to do this, or we have to zoom this up, or we have to change the frame rate, or we have to do these things. It's great when you know later, but if you know ahead of time that you're going to need X amount of smoothness or data or everything else, I would definitely recommend not doing that.
And I want to bring up one point. It depends on, is time more important or is money more important to you? Because if you have something like this, we talked about the fact that a high ISO gain pushed up to get a bad result, a noise. There is nothing more complex than trying to denoise a very noisy image. So you literally may find yourself running one of these excellent tools like Topaz that'll do it, but you may be looking at 24 hours of processing or even longer to get that out of a series of images. Remember, you're shooting 30 separate frames a second, or 24 if you're doing that. And if you have a 10-second shot, that is a tremendous number of frames to denoise over the course of time. And you can get yourself – I've known people who have literally let things cook for a week to try to denoise something. And if they just shot it without all that extra ISO gain, they wouldn't have had to waste any of that extra time. So time versus money is always a consideration. Let's go to the next question.
Next question is from Roz Humphreys in Comox, British Columbia, Canada. Thinking of buying some used lenses just to play with some looks. Is there a quick way to test basic functionality? Use a chart, I guess.
Yeah, there are charts. There are lens accuracy charts that put up. Usually, it's what Alex shows occasionally here. These charts with a lot of trompeter lines and things like that, and that'll give you, as those lines come into the side and kind of get smaller and smaller, it'll show you the extent of resolution that the particular lens can resolve. Alex, you want to go into more detail about that?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that I use, and there's a variety of ones that you can use, but they do have to be printed at a very high resolution if you're using a 4K or something like that. But these are some of the ones that we use from DSC Labs. I think I have this one. I think I have this one. So these are a couple different ones, and they test different things, resolution across different angles. There are some other print ones, but these are the kinds of things that you're looking for, and you want to really think about some of these. If you search for resolution charts, there are print ones that a lot of photographers use too. A lot of times it's different things at different angles because you'll see some aberration and other things at those angles. But definitely you're going to want to buy this chart. People will be tempted to print it. You very rarely have a printer that has high enough resolution to print these lines thin enough that you're going to actually be able to tell any difference. So that's something to actually take a look at.
Nigel?
Yeah, I bought a lot of secondhand lenses from our local camera store. And so they allow me to play with that lens. I take pictures. I do various things. I'm not going to be able to set up what Alex has shown. But the other thing they do is rent those lenses. And if you can rent a lens before you buy it, then you can take it home. You can play with it for a while and you can get the sense. Generally, I've been very happy with all the secondhand lenses I've had. They don't always look perfect. They're a bit scruffed and scratched. Occasionally the zoom's a bit sticky, depending on what it's been done. But you can also get that cleaned as well as you want. But see if you can rent or borrow and play with it for a while.
Yeah, and that pinwheel kind of chart Alex used, we used typically in parfocal lenses that want to maintain their focus through the zoom thing. You're going to take something, and I don't have a good picture of it. Here's the quickest one I found. But that little kind of pinwheel thing in the center, those converge down at a point, and one of the ways you use them with a parfocal lens is you zoom out wide, you focus, you zoom in tight, and if it doesn't keep the focus, you adjust the back focus, which is the minute distance between the back plane of the lens and the sensor, until you can keep focus at both the full push in and full pull out. And if you do that correctly, then your camera is correctly set to be able to zoom through shots and maintain focus all the way through. Alex?
Yeah, we use the circular ones that Bill was talking about to get our lenses in focus, but we have a tendency to use the resolution charts that have those lines are a very, very specific distance, and if they merge together, we know that's the actual resolution that is available there. But for that circular one, what we typically do to do back focus is we'll set the focus of the lens at 10 feet. We'll make sure that it's 10 feet from the sensor, and then we'll focus it on the back focus, and then we lock it, and then we start testing in and out. We zoom in to test things and make sure that it's working and make any fine adjustments. But that's how that circular one works. But to test the actual resolution, you're going to want ones that have the little lines that you see there that get closer and closer together, because that where they start to merge together, it tells you what that lens is resolving.
And I think what you're hearing here from all of us is that all these different charts and measurements are because this is complicated. Lens construction and performance is a very complicated science. It's been studied for 100 years plus. And so learning about how to test things objectively, so you're not saying, is it in focus or isn't it in focus? Is it not in focus because my lens is misset or because I've got something else wrong? All of this helps you understand how to get to the goal, which is that if you want to be in tack sharp focus from the tip of the nose to the back of the ear, and you find yourself in a situation where your lens is wide open because there's not enough light there and you've got a very shallow depth of field, and you need to place your focus plane precisely to get the results you want, you're able to do that. And you have to know that your tools do that, and you have to know that your thinking does that as well. Let's get to the next question.
Next question is from me. Do parfocal lenses exist for micro four thirds cameras, or can they be adapted?
Alex?
Not many. So I think the only ones I know of are DZO. DZO makes some that are in the $1,500, $2,000 range. There's like two. Like that. The only ones I've ever seen are the DZO ones that are designed for that.
We should also mention, since more and more people are taking photos using their phones and things like that, the computational photography is working very heavily on these things. You know, there are not just a lens on most smartphones at the high end now. There are lens arrays, and they're doing complex things in terms of sampling multiple lens signals and then trying to take the best focal performance out of each of those lenses and then instantly marry it through some kind of onboard computational photography into a picture that it presents to you that is actually better focused than what any one of those lenses would do. That's kind of why they're spending so much time on these cameras and why these phone cameras perform amazingly well. Courtney, you had some thoughts?
As far as adapting, you'll find places on the interwebs where they're taking these old ingenue 20-to-1s or 10-to-1s that are designed for cinema, 16 millimeter, and adapting them to the Blackmagic camera there. So you can do it. You have to change the back focal distance, and so sometimes you might have to have something custom made or find something where it has an adjustable back focus distance. to get that. And there will be vignetting at certain focal ranges, so you can have some vignetting softening around the edges. So it's a hit or miss, but you can find some of those old ingenues parfocal lenses on eBay that were great lenses during their time.
Absolutely. You reminded me when I saw that rig that when I started getting into better iPhones, I spent an afternoon on my back balcony next to the golf course, and I was using binoculars and an adapter for my iPhone's camera. And you can actually do that and shoot through and get a lot more distance. That's when I reminded myself about what chromatic aberration is all about, because binoculars do not have a particularly perfect set of lenses unless you're working on maybe a set of Zeiss binoculars. The set I'd had did not have great performance characteristics. I could use the thing effectively and try to, I think I was shooting birds because there's a lot of wildlife out behind my house. So I was trying to get a moving picture of one of maybe the terns flying by. And it was challenging. And when I stopped and did still photography of those, I found a lot of chromatic aberration and things like that. It reminded me once again how important lenses are. Let's go to the next question.
Next question is from Talalik Lopez Waterman in Wilmington, Delaware. I have had the experience of seeing the difference between a very high-quality lens and a less expensive one. They both get sharp, but I can't put my finger on what exactly is better that I am seeing. Any thoughts?
Alex?
They both look sharp. A lot of what you're seeing is oftentimes chromatic aberration. So you're not going to see it as colors, but everything is just a little off on a cheaper lens because not all of those colors are coming in at the same speed. And a lot of times that's what creates a feeling of softness that you tend not to see when you're on a higher quality lens.
Alexander?
I would recommend looking up on YouTube a channel called CVP. They do these amazing technical reviews of cameras and lenses, including all the different technical tests involved in testing lenses. One of the things that I've noticed too, which as being someone inexperienced, was when you look at the short depth of field and you really examine the quality of the bokeh, the typical cat's eye effect, and every lens will be different. And a lot of the higher end lenses will have better bokeh and they won't be as stretched out or distorted. So that's one thing to always look for in higher lenses. And again, a lot of people in cinema, they want a specific look and they're willing to pay for it. And that certainly is something that you'll get with better quality lenses.
Let's sneak to the next question.
Next question is from Josh Kaufman in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. How have tools like Unreal Engine changed the process of previsualization in video production?
Alex?
Yeah, it's changing it. So it hasn't really happened yet, but we're seeing more and more Unreal Engine being used in previsualization. And some of it has to do with, they're not really, it's lens choice. There is some depth of field, but the depth of field is still computationally expensive. So a lot of times when you're doing previs, you're not doing as much of that, but you're doing some of it. Even back when we were doing Star Wars, we were putting things out of focus to give you a sense of what those things look like back in episode 25 years ago with episode 1. But I would say that Unreal Engine is making a huge difference in being able to build sequences, especially action sequences, that you really get a sense of how this is all going to work. A lot of these sequences are very expensive to produce when you actually go out and do them. So making the edits and really the closer you can get to it feeling real allows the editor to make those value choices before they start building those apparatuses or green screens or all the other visual effects that have to be done. You don't want to cut a final shot that costs you $200,000 out of the film. You want to cut it when it costs you $2,000 to do the previs.
Courtney?
Yeah, and the previses can be a lot more complicated with a much more complex camera moves. You typically, a lot of times, previses would just be static frames to give you basically what the framing starts at and maybe what the framing ends at. But a very complex camera move that is, let's say, like a walk and talk or something like that, you could previs with the background, with 3D backgrounds of where they're going to be walking through shown in the background, so that you could let what has to be built, what doesn't have to be built, what has to be propped, etc. So it's getting there. Like Alex said, it'll be a little more comprehensive, and then once you have your location accurately mapped, then it's going to be even better for previs.
Yeah, I think all of those, I think we can see the future. Those kinds of tools are going to be useful. But, it's interesting to me that Unreal Engine, part of what it's so brilliant at is trying to recreate realistic worlds. And realistic worlds obey the laws of physics, as do lenses and the rest of this. All the content we've been watching for the last 100 years has probably come through some sort of lenses, with very few exceptions. And we kind of know from watching content for so long what those things look like. So when you get into a world building in Unreal, to understand these lens characteristics, to understand how they work, maybe at the level of craziness where lens flares in a digital thing become a thing to kind of fake you into thinking you're actually using a real lens, when in fact it's a digitally created and manipulated lens flare to make it look like it came through a camera lens. This is just the state of where we are now. So I think we've gone through our questions for today, so I'm going to wrap things up with our standard, which is thank you to so many people who have been a part of this. Everybody on all of the crews, and I'll mention them in just a second, but first I have to do our Talk Traversal. We traveled 54,000 miles today. That's 87,000 kilometers. This is a long distance, and we did that because everybody accumulated their knowledge here. Thank you to everybody who's on the panel today and everybody who's been on the panel in the past for volunteering their expertise and knowledge. We also want to thank all of you who added questions into this. This conversation doesn't happen every day without your input, and we truly appreciate the time you spend putting your questions into office hours every single day. And the back-end crew, those not nameless or faceless, because if you watch the credit roll at the end, you can see their names. And most of us know their faces because we deal with them every day, and we are incredibly proud to be a part of this network where so many people with so much expertise freely donate their time and energy into making things that are maybe not so understandable to more people. We are about to dive into that. I went through the Talk Traversal. I think all I have to do now is say, if you try to get this information, you would have had to travel the equivalent of 428 million bananas for scale. We'll see you tomorrow.
How many miles is that?
I said that early. I got out of cars. 54,000 miles was our Talk Traversal today. If you'd had to go sit in front of each person who asked a question or participated in the show in the Q&A, that's how far you had to travel to get their expertise. And thank you to the internet for allowing us to do it in real time live. No, I was sweating bullets about for some reason, the iPad, which I had left in charging my pencil mode down to zero.
Was it one of them newfangled $3,000 ones?
Nah, this is like, this is old. This is my everyday iPad Pro that sits next to me that I use mostly for script management.
I'm going to have to get my old iPad out of the closet and see if battery is still alive. I don't think I've turned it on since about 2016.
You may have a little battery issue with that, Courtney. See y'all tomorrow.